Hello, this presentation is being brought to you today by Summit Gold Liquid Plant Food, a premium supplier of plant nutrients and technologies in the industry. And today we're going to be talking specifically about targeting liquid nutrients, its uses and efficiencies of banded and foliar applied liquids. And in a big picture, I think often people think we are trying to make life harder by asking them to use liquids on their planter or liquids in some fashion. There are really no other means of getting the highest levels of efficiency for nutrients other than bands in and on the row and the furrow, other than foliars. And so as technology changes and efficiencies must change for us to be able to survive in the big picture, we have to understand how these technologies work. And I think a lot of people are under the misunderstanding that as long as there are three numbers, for instance, on a page that represent NP and K, that all NP and K and all forms are exactly alike. Some are more expensive, some less expensive, some more challenging to work with than others. But the reality of it is they do work, they do have specific things they accomplish, and different forms of different elements in the way they're presented to a soil and a plant make them perceived different by both the soil and the plant. So just because they're numbers on a page doesn't mean they're all the same. One form may have a multiplicity of things that it can accomplish relative to one other one just being an element and can only just get into a solution and get inside a plant. So our objective today is to help you understand how these systems and these products work in a targeted fashion. So, how do we work in liquid versus dry? The first and foremost thing you have to understand is basically what does the plant see eventually based on a system that we might use? And when we write about effective parts per million, we're really speaking of in a soil, let's say 6 inches deep across an acre, 1 part per million is the same as 2 pounds per acre. So a 200-pound dry potassium application of 0060 might result in a 60 part per million actual concentration of potassium if it was dissolved, allowed to be in the soil solution after it was scattered. If we went to a 2x2 banded potassium thiosulfate, for instance, or KTS, as you see it in parentheses here, at 1 to 2 gallon, which would be a good rate, you might be looking at something in the range of 400 to 600 parts per million in a band near the row itself, near the plant itself. So you have dramatically increased the ability of the plant to find it in a much higher concentration. So the resulting effect is you don't need nearly as much material to accomplish the same goal. Now, if you were to take that from a 2x2 band and put it directly on the furrow right with the seed, you could potentially raise that level again another 3 to 5 times, and so be somewhere in the vicinity of 1,200 to 600 parts per million, effectively being somewhere in the vicinity of 2,400 to 3,200 pounds to the acre. Even though that's not what the total quantity would be, the plant is finding lots and lots and lots of material. With an expanded root system and the use of biostimulant products together with that, you can increase the effective parts per million further, because what you're really doing is, as you understand this down the line, is the microbes are interacting with the soil and the plant, and they all, in some cases, are actually helping different nutrients get into the plant as the plant requests for them. It's a strange new world that we understand that the biochemists and plant physiologists and microbiologists are telling us about this area. So research demonstrating the benefits of target fertilizer placement. Back several years ago, Dr. Fred Bilo over at University of Illinois, they were interested in looking at what kind of things achieve higher yields with fertilizer placement. And what they found for that study was, liquid allows for timely and efficient direct foliar application or application on the soil. And the closer it is to the root mass or applied directly to the plant, you dramatically increase the ability of that plant to find the nutrition. So for instance, if you put it right underneath the seed or right next to the seed or right in the 2x2, if you were to get, for instance, 1/10 of an inch of rain, on that plant and funnel that water down to the bottom of that plant, which all of us who've grown corn have seen that in the past, where you might see an inch or an inch and a half of wet area right around that stalk base. If the fertilizer is down there and the plant finds that water, that 1/10 of an inch of rain could be the equivalent in what that plant finds of a full inch of rain over the entire profile farther away from the plant, that the plant would have to get that nutrient so far away from itself. So 1/10 of an inch is an achievable goal. 1 inch all the time is not. So even heavy dews oftentimes will give you that kind of a return on investment. When we go to the timely and efficient direct foliar application, that reduces tie up in the soil, because tie up in the soil always extracts a certain amount of fertility with chemistry, other biology that's vying for certain nutrients and elements. And so by taking away that soil element, your liquid spraying on a foliar is 6 to 10 times more efficient. So if you were to put on 1 pound, or let's say 10 or 20 pounds out on the soil, you could accomplish the same thing as 1 to 2 pounds directly on the plants. And so people are finding this all the time, that they are much more successful with foliars. It also eliminates the uncertainty of a release curve. When certain things have to either melt out and get into a different form before they can be absorbed by the plant, all of these things where all the oddball stuff going on that we don't necessarily understand is taking its piece, it eliminates that. Now, chemistry is something that very few of us understand. Many of us may have had a chemistry course back in high school. It might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. We don't remember it. And so in some cases, it's a friend or foe based on whether or not we even recognize it. However, regardless of that, when you start putting chemistry into the soil itself may find certain levels of chemistry, friend or foe. An excellent example of that is phosphate fertilizers. Many of you might have been down to Florida and you've seen the phosphate mines in Central or South Florida. All they do is mine out an apatite mineral. Calcium phosphate is the chemical name, but it's called apatite as the mineral name would show here. And all they do is take 1 ton of apatite and react it with 1 ton of sulfuric acid. And when they do, that yields 1 ton of phosphoric fertilizer. Phosphate fertilizers then are applied to your soil, and a portion of that, when it begins to melt and solubilize, actually, if you have calcium in your soil, which all of us do here in the Midwest and in the Eastern Corn Belt, the calcium will react with that phosphate fertilizer and go back to its original calcium phosphate or apatite mineral. That's what you see there, the 3 calciums with the 2 phosphates, that chemical equation there is basically, or that's the derivation for calcium phosphate or apatite. So even when we're well-intentioned and buying good fertilizer, it can be a foe, because the calcium that's free and available in our soil will tie up some of that phosphate. Therein lies the discussion that the TVA and the PPI told us for years, that when we apply phosphate fertilizers to our soil, we may be lucky in life if we ever get 50% or more of our phosphate fertilizer that we applied actually to work in our favor. That's the foe of chemistry in the soil. So when you have this happening, now you're tying up both phosphorus and calcium, resulting in missing reserves. So for instance, you might suspect that the number for your phosphate should go up higher based on how much fertilizer you've put in. And in reality, it doesn't move very much, or it only moves a little. It's missing in action, and it's tying up calcium, which is very important in making cell walls for plants and for microbes. And believe it or not, the microbes themselves have enzymes to be able to break that calcium phosphate, or that apatite as we call it, back apart. So biology can help restore some of the missing reserves. And so for some things, some growers who have used biologicals for years, they might notice that their phosphate levels don't go down for many, many years. Matter of fact, they may go up initially and for several years level out, and then after many, many years start heading back down. So that's all that phosphorus that tied up for many, many years, and biology is helping release it. It's no surprise then that when the researchers tell us that 90% of our phosphate has to pass through biology, this is exactly what they're referring to. So if more phosphate is continued to be applied than needed, you begin to short your supply of calcium, as we just showed, zinc, which has a 2+ charge, just like calcium, and zinc and phosphate love each other, then they marry together and magnetize very quickly. Manganese has a 2+ charge. Iron has a 2+ and a 3+ charge. Copper has a 2+ charge. So if you start putting in way more phosphate than you need, you end up, because of that very, very strong negative charge on phosphate, tying up 2 calciums or 2 zincs or 2 manganese, along with those, or actually 3 of each one of those, with those 2 phosphate ions. So you're tying up all kinds of nutrition just by overloading with phosphorus. If you need to release it again, you can apply sulfur back to that soil. And as you apply more and more sulfate fertilizer, you make a little more sulfuric acid. And that reaction between the sulfur and the original material up here that we talked about, reacting sulfur fertilizer with apatite, if you put sulfate and sulfur fertilizer on your apatite, it will break it back apart. So sulfur is becoming a very, very important part of people managing and making their chemistry friendly again without having to invest lots and lots of money back into phosphate fertilizer. So this whole idea of understanding how these things interact can be very important to you in understanding dollar efficiencies on your farm. If you're a farm that you have had a lot of ground from yourself, a father or grandfather or multiple generations, and you have been investing in phosphate fertilizers for decades, it may be something as simple as you need to switch over to using sulfur to make these things effectively useful for you, and in conjunction with biostimulants can be a real game changer. What are we really accomplishing with banded liquid nutrients? Well, liquid phosphate fertilizer, if it's done properly with orthophosphate, there's a difference between orthophosphate and polyphosphate. Orthophosphate is your available form. It's not changed back into polyphosphate. Polyphosphate just means chains of phosphates that are banded together and have to be broken apart to be converted to orthophosphate. So by putting liquid phosphate starter in the right form, you can dramatically increase the quantity of available phosphate going into a plant early. You can increase the energy for crop emergence and yield. Grasses set their yield, in some cases, like for corn, it's by V3. V3 to V5, that whole yield and ear size has been completely determined. In young wheat plants, in young barley plants, in young oat plants where they make a panicle, sorghum plants that make a panicle, all of that is determined typically by the time that plant is within its first 30 active heat growing accumulating days. Liquid potash and sulfur products, for instance, in furrow and sideband, do many things. Supplement your potassium. They're readily available, and you can make them much more readily available if you keep them in a band like that. The sulfur in and of itself does many, many things, and we'll get into that here in a little bit, but sulfur is a specific for proteins and amino acid development, which are critical for any plant and or animal that's in nature. There are 3 essential proteins that are sulfur requiring. And also when we're talking about corn, there is a zein protein that is actually developed before the corn plant is really at its emergent stage. And that zein protein is what sets the total number of kernels on an ear. So if you have sulfur 12 to 15 inches down in your soil, if the ear is determined by V3 to V5, that means the roots that come out of the seed are what sets the ear. So if you're putting your sulfur way down in the soil or just waiting for the plant to find it, you're not necessarily making the biggest ear potential that you can make. So by putting them in the furrow or in a sideband, you can maximize your ability to make sure that you make big ears on your corn plant consistently. They're very essential in amino acid and protein, as I said. They acidify a nutrient band. So you may need acid in your soil, especially if you're already setting at a high pH or a pH of 7, which many people think is smart, but it really isn't, because at pH 7, you've got a very low quantity of acid. That's basically on a scale of 0 to 14, 7 is the center, which means that alkalinity and acidity are equal. And so the acid is dropping by a rocket when you get it at pH 7. There's very, very low quantities of acid left. That could be very difficult for microbes that are needing acid to find acid, or plants to be able to get their nutrition, because acid in a soil would melt out metals like copper and zinc and manganese and iron. And so if you have acid, you have other nutrients more readily available. Now, you don't want lots of it. Somewhere around 10% of your soil could be acid, which would have a pH of about 6.3 on an average, and that's perfect to be able to work with plants and soil productivity. Biostimulant additives, if you put them in there along with the potassium and the sulfur, there are plant growth regulating effects that occur as a result of using certain biostimulants. Increased roots and top growth are a direct result, because many of these biostimulants will produce plant growth regulating products. And as you increase the root mass dramatically, common sense tells you it's easier to find more and more nutrition. Ironically, is if you load your soil up with lots and lots of nutrition, plants don't have to send roots very far to find them. And you could imagine if you had a very, very short water year and a very poor root mass, you're not going to extract water very well at all. So oftentimes too much fertilizer teases plants into not having good roots, and you can suffer on the back end of having too much fertilizer up front and not enough water to support what you've made. Microbes increase the efficiency of plant gathering nutrients. There are signals that actually go out from the plants to the microbes now. The microbiologists tell us that. And they will produce enzymes that actually help release elements out of minerals back for the plant. So the microbes are actually designed to help usher in certain nutrients into plants. Microbes increase the nutrient availability by cellulizing nutrients from the soil minerals. We just discussed that. Stabilizing nutrients and preventing the movement out of the root zone. Oftentimes, microbes can bioregulate that whole process. And by doing so, help moderate losses. You can actually, for instance, in nitrogen, if you turn nitrogen into biological nitrogen, it will not be converted to nitrate. It will be stabilized in the soil as an amine form or ammonium forms. And as microbes die and split open, that natural nitrogen comes out as an amine form, and it doesn't get converted to nitrate. So plants love to use that form. That's the form that basically programs a plant to be reproductive, and it does not leave the root zone. So management strategies in the future that are going to reduce nitrates are going to be involved with biological products. Bioregulation of potash and other nutrients is a big part of this. They help prevent the nutrient imbalances by buffering over supply. It builds in a forgiveness factor. What we're really referring to there is, for instance, in some cases, if you just have boatloads of potassium in this soil and that corn plant begins to grow, all grasses suffer from a process called luxury consumption. Luxury consumption just means relative to potash, if a plant finds potash, it would rather pull it in than many other things. And so what happens is it tends to create an imbalance inside itself because it has way too much potash that it doesn't need. If it gets lots and lots of potash, it needs water to be able to move things around more effectively because of the salts. And so when you got too much potash, you've got too much water inside a plant. The only way that you can negate that in some cases is to either not put the potash there or put in far, far more calcium so that the plant can actually get some calcium. And when it gets calcium, it won't necessarily pull in all that potash. If you pull in too much potash too soon on a young corn plant, you can't get ammonium nitrogen into the plant because they both have the same value of charge, 1+. You make smaller ears. So you might have situations where you think you're doing yourself big favors by putting out lots of potash. And even since when you put out the potash, you might have got some yield increases. We have very good documentable evidence that when people do this and they get carried away with it, they're missing somewhere between 30 and 50 to 80 bushels an acre from the top end that they never saw again when they put in too much potash. Once they drop that potash, it can actually increase the yield potential because the balance of nutrition is more important to the plant than the total quantity of nutrition. So by bioregulating this thing with certain microbes, they can make calcium available so the plant can pick it up. Here's a picture of the system systematic approach to feeding a plant, creating uniformity in yield. Everything about what we're doing is trying to help people understand that if you put the nutrients in the right place, if you put them in with the right balance, and you put them in so that every seed can find it the same way, you'll see that your goal is a larger, more consistent ear on every single plant. There are only so many ways that you can accomplish that, folks, and one of the best ways is with a planter. And so most of us have heard that that planter really is a planting tool, not a fertilizer bar. But in reality, the only way you're going to deliver that consistently to each and every plant in a furrow is with that planter. As this picture shows, down into the lower left, you can see a product like 725-5, which is high orthophosphate fertilizer, in conjunction with something like KRow, which is a potassium product that is very similar to potassium thiosulfate, but it's a little more safer, doesn't carry the salt. With some biologicals, all of those together, and some micronutrients in furrow can go right on the seed. And as you see there, there are two clearly distinct root masses. If you look at the picture, you'll see the seed underneath it, and the radical and seminal roots come out from that. And then once the plant reaches about 5 to 6 leaves, the nodal roots start to show above the soil, and they take over and grow the infrastructure. In the whole big picture of this, by putting on something like the elements that we're talking about around that seed, raising your calcium levels in the soil to make sure that things are being buffered properly, and you have a good growing and ecological development for your microbes and your bios. And by putting off to the right side, as you see where the purple arrow is, a banded 28 or 32% with some KTS, some potassium thiosulfate, which really is better served as something over 2x2 or 3x2 or 4x2, or small quantities that are delivered foliar. If you can do this by putting the phosphate on there to make the ears bigger and fatter, nitrogen on here to make the ears longer, and sulfur to allow the maximum total number of kernels to be put on that ear, that will give you that whole idea of a more consistent ear potential. Summit Gold has a product that basically is called SG Infuse, and SG Infuse carries a lot of these products already in it. That's something that you can learn specifically from their people. What about that plant microbe interaction? Putting those microbes down there may sound foreign to some people, and then to others who understand what's going on, it makes perfect sense. On the right here, you have a picture of what's called Bacillus subtilis or Bacillus subtilis, and it fluoresces under UV light. And so what you see here is microbes are designed to be encompassing root masses all the time. The little angular things that you see up through that fluorescence are basically hair roots. And a plant is designed to actually exchange things mostly through those hair roots. They give off sugars and they pull in nutrients. They give off amino acids and they pull in nutrients. They give off proteins and they pull in nutrients. There's an interaction at what we call the rhizosphere, or that interaction between that plant hair root and that soil system. And it's intimate and it's ongoing and constantly changing. So you can imagine if biology is doing work right in that zone, all kinds of things are different for that plant right at that zone. Much different than even in some places, no more than a quarter to a half inch or a full inch away, it could be an entirely different world. And we can actually feed things to that plant and cause that plant to kick them out along this biosphere, this rhizosphere we're talking about. And we can actually help a plant change its environment in that area by putting some of these specific liquid situations to bear on this plant. All of this is designed to work together for mutual benefit. Microbes are designed to increase the efficiency of any and all fertilizers that are around this plant. It's the same thing that goes on in your fence rows. If you've ever torn out a fence row or get close to the side ditch and you see the things grow far, far better there, it's because there are far, far more existing microbes in higher quantities and different diversities. And so they work together to help each other. They communicate with chemical signals. There are many chemical signals that have been figured out in the past. One of those that we're familiar with when we call LCO promoters between rhizobium and soybeans. Those chemical signals actually come out from the root that says, I'm a soybean looking for a rhizobium bacteria to infect me. The rhizobium sends out chemical signals that says, I'm a rhizobium out here willing to work with a soybean. The chemical signals find each other. The plant sends a root to the rhizobium. It opens up its ability to allow that rhizobium to infect it. And lo and behold, a nodule grows and nitrogen is released. Those are infections that we see, and we can actually see it being expressed right before our eyes in the form of that nodule. All these other interactions react exactly the same way, except there aren't any nodules. So it's no surprise as to how things are working, and people begin to understand it more and more all the time. There are benefits to the plant of this reaction. Nutrition obviously is the number one. Anything we can do to help improve the nutrition and nutritional uptake to the plant and to the microbes for doing the work. It's a give and take down there. Protection, many of these microbes that are around these roots are products that actually can control or keep in check other bad guy types of microbes that do damage. They can actually live here, as you see where this green area is with subtilis. If they take up all the area where the food is, the bad guys don't get to the roots and they can't destroy them. So there are benefits to that in sense. Growth hormones, many of these microbes make IAA or IBA, which are just designations for certain root growth hormones, and dramatically increase the root size and the stalk size and the leaf size of plants. Banded sulfur. Let's talk specifically about KTS, potassium thiosulfate, and KRow. Potassium thiosulfate, the thio means elemental sulfur. So when you're using potassium thiosulfate, you're getting potassium sulfate along with elemental sulfur that can eventually be oxidized or have oxygen added to it and can be converted directly over to sulfate sulfur. KRow is potassium bisulfite, which eventually, when you mix it with water, becomes indirectly potassium thiosulfate, but it has a much lower salt content and does not do as much damage. So KRow is designed to be used, as it says, in the row, right on the seed, where KTS should typically be more to a 2x2 band or maybe slightly foliar. Sulfur is an essential element for amino acid or protein production. So anything that's providing that sulfur, whether it's ammonium thiosulfate, KRow, potassium thiosulfate, any sulfate sulfur of any kind, it's all helpful. And we are grossly deficient in sulfur anymore. A lot of the striping that you see, people incorrectly assume it's zinc deficiency, and oftentimes it's really sulfur deficiency. So getting that sulfur in and near that plant very early is critical in developing its color. Most people who put KRow right on the seed will tell you that the plants come out of the ground black-green, and they stay black-green through most of the entire year. Our crops need it. Our microorganisms need it because basically they are livestock, if you will, in the soil. And just like our livestock that we raise above the ground, we need specific amino acids and proteins to sustain them and grow them. You get an acidification of the banded zone, which is very important in some cases in safening fertilizers. Oftentimes low salt fertilizers aren't really dangerous because of salt, but if they have high pHs, they might be up in the 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5 pH range, and there's no acid. In some cases, if you see that there's no acid, oftentimes what happens is the microbes will find something like an ammonium ion, which is a nitrogen ion with 4 hydrogens floating around it. And when they pull off one of those hydrogens because they need acid to do their work, and that's readily available in that starter, that now makes ammonia. When you make ammonia, you've made a volatile nitrogen gas, and everybody knows that ammonia will burn you. And what happens oftentimes is you'll get a burning of the roots in the row, and you thought it might have come from salt. It didn't really come from salt. It came from the fact that if there was very low acid and a high pH, like let's say the soil was pH 7, and you had a high pH product of 7.5, 8, or 8.5, you just basically tied up all the acid, and the microbes are doing things to hurt you, and you didn't even know what was going on. It'll create sulfuric acid in that zone, and once you've acidified that sulfuric acid drives the pH down, and when you drive the pH down, you can melt out your metals. You're dropping the pH of a liquid band zone to increase microbial activity, because when those microbes do have enough acid, they work far more effectively. You don't want boatloads, you just need enough to get the job done. Nutrients and micronutrient metals release in those acidic conditions. We've covered that once or twice. The useful tool that you get in alkaline soils with this system is extremely important. If you have alkaline soils, and that just means high pH or basic soil conditions, you're tying up nutrition. You have all kinds of things that are basically chemically your foe, not your friend. And you don't want to try and change that alkaline soil all the way back to an acid soil with lots and lots and lots of added sulfur or acid products. You're taking on the entire world of that soil in some cases, and it's just too much. So the best way to fix that problem is to use these acidified bands and allow for these chemistry changes to be near the plant and the plant roots so that the plant can get what it needs. You just need to help it find it, and these acid bands in alkaline soils, as we work out into the plains and into the West, have dramatically improved the productivity quotient of our growers' crops for many years now. We use that very successfully on a wide basis. How about the soil properties and their interdependency? I mean, a lot of people aren't even aware of this. I guess they should know about it after soil health has become a real issue. That center point that you see with those three circles between the physical, biological, and chemical condition, help you understand that sweet spot is where soil health actually comes from. That's the whole idea of getting the physical condition, the air-water management in very good shape, the biological side being more and more quantities of better and better microbes all the time and kind of helping knock the bad guys back down to where they belong off to the side and not really being bothersome to the plant. And the chemistry in terms of its balance and the proper use of the chemistry and the timing of the plant that you're growing. If you can do all these in sync, your soil repairs itself much, much quicker than most people ever can believe. The idea of the three working together as a stool, three-legged stool, if you will, and not having, you know, one or two of those legs being too short or too long, allows balance in the soil and a plant working in that balance to work properly and efficiently, and all of the pieces of the puzzle to work together. The irony of this is if you really oversupply one or the other of these, they interact with each other. So if you get the physical condition out of whack and you get very, very low organic matter, the biology doesn't do well. The biology doesn't do well and doesn't release, like for instance, phosphate, then the chemical changes. So your pH or your soil test will change. And so physical condition gets out of whack and all of a sudden you have low phosphate levels. Well, that's a result of doing one side with too much physical activity and having an impact on both the biology and the chemistry. And it works just the opposite. If you change the chemistry too hard, the biology may shut down and it doesn't make the right kinds of soil grease and the physical condition falls out. So you have to till more. So they are all interdependent. This is a very, very important part. If you don't get this, you may not get anything we've talked about today, but this is one of the keys. The soil is designed to feed the plant. All the things we're trying to do here with this whole idea of liquid fertilizers and placement should help us understand that. We're putting nutrients in the soil so that the plant can pick them up. But very few people understand the plant is designed to feed the soil. When you see that whole plant, if you've ever watched the liquid flow in a very high quality movie where they're actually showing plants living in the soil, you'll see the fluid move down through the plant and out through the roots and out of those root hairs in a circle and make a complete circle and come back into that plant. That means that the plant is actually feeding or pushing things out to the soil and bringing in nutrients and coming back. And it's a continuous cycle of a pumping effect, both water, nutrients, and sugars going out and amino acids going out to the soil. If you understand how they work together, they replenish and care for each other's needs. So that's why biology is there in the first place. If it wasn't, why in the world would plants continue to pump out their very, very important sugars and nutrients to the soil? They may push out as much as 50% of the stuff that they make to the soil. They don't do it just to make the soil change for them based on sugars and amino acids going out for no one. They're pushing it out for the microbes to care for them. If you see this and understand it, then many of the questions that you may have raised over the last 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years that you may have never answered before will start to be answered. If you miss it, you'll always have more questions about why things go wrong then you can come up with answers. Even when we talk about herbicides and some of the impact they've had. If a herbicide takes off hair roots and a plant can't feed its soil, why would a herbicide do significant damage to that plant? Well, a plant without hair roots can't feed its microbes, so it's not going to grow right, it's not going to get fed right, and so herbicides can kill or greatly stunt or hurt plants. And so all it really is doing is impacting everything that we're saying right here. The targeted liquid products that we're thinking about giving you information on would be things like, again, 725-5, the high orthophosphate fertilizer, the SG infused to the right of that, which is a premix combination of foods, protectants, micronutrients, biostimulants, a whole host of things that actually start that plant off on the seed in the furrow, dramatically different than anything else. Even if you have your own favorite on-seed starter, by mixing products like SG Infuse in there with it, you can make any starter better with biology, micronutrients, food sources, and protectants. The KRow on the left, KRow 23, is the label from Tesindalo Curly. That's its logo for a potassium-rich 0023 8% sulfur, which is lower salt and better on the furrow. KTS right underneath that, potassium thiosulfate, liquid fertilizer, and 0025-17, which has got a little more salt concentration, so it's really better off either as a foliar in small quantities, maybe a quart to 2 quarts to the acre, or off to the side of the row at 1 to 2 gallons. On the right side, the last two, Max Grow. Max Grow is a very good, high-quality sugar, amino acid, and some live biology product that you can put in there as a food source and a sugar source and an amino acid source for plants that can be put on foliar, can go in furrow, can go on the 2x2 band. It has a multiplicity of things it can do. And then complement on the bottom is the name for the specific group of live biological microbes that can be included in soil applications right on the seed. Again, in a 2x2, it can go out through Y drops when you're doing later nitrogen applications or side dressing to be able to stabilize it. Instead of just killing the microbes, feed more microbes to the system, actually get them to eat up the nitrogen, and they will stabilize it for weeks and weeks and release it over a much, much more complete period. So they can also be used, the complement organisms can also be used foliar, and we're finding all kinds of new opportunities for that as we begin to see that microbes are communicating with plants on the surface of the leaves. The complement organisms can go out there in some cases as low as 2 to 4 or 6 ounces to the acre in with all kinds of foliar applications and do a marvelous job. That's what we wanted to talk to you today. We thank you for your attention, and we hope that if you have questions that you'll get with your Summit Gold representative in your area. And if you're having any difficulty finding that person or someone to help you, you can always go online, type in Summit Gold, and you'll be able to get someone to talk to at that point. So thanks for your attention and have a great day.